So, for the second part of our module on gender, sex, and sexuality, we're going to be looking at the theoretical perspectives and inequalities. So, we're starting this module off by discussing the various theoretical perspectives and how they view gender. So, starting with functionalist perspective, basically the socially constructed binary here adds to the stability of society by divvying up roles, right? Again, remember that functionalist perspective kind of says that these things have purposes, even if they're unequal or unjust, they are serving some purpose for someone, right? Or else we would get rid of them. And so here, the functionalist is saying that one of the purposes of the binary is to have people in both expressive roles and instrumental roles. So expressiveness, again, denotes that concern for the maintenance, harmony, and internal affairs of the family, while instrumentality is really emphasizing tasks and goals and this external relationship between the family and social institutions. So here, they're saying that with family being this most integral component of society, that the assumptions that we see about gender roles within the family have a really prominent place in society as well. So those gender roles have permeated through time. They were established well before industrialization, and they were considered to be functional. They were considered to be useful for society. And so when we start to see women entering into the workforce in particular, and taking positions that men held when they were away at war, primarily, this kind of change in roles helped us to maintain a stable society. But the problem was that after that, not all women wanted to leave the workforce when the guys got back, and that led to instability. And so we actually see that the through the functionalist perspective that those roles were functional, um, but that there is um, not necessarily um, peace that occurs with that functionality, um, and that a- attaching those specific roles to specific people in society and saying that because you have this biology, then you're supposed to have this role is problematic, because one of the things that could have happened was that women could have just stayed in that position and men could have taken up those roles, right? And so what they're basically saying is somebody has to do it, right? And forcing people to do it through this gender division of labor, that we've seen trickle down throughout time, has been one of the ways or one of the solutions. And now that's no longer the case, right? We're not forcing people to do work because of their anatomy or biology. And so we need to figure something else out. Instead, we still need those roles to be done, right? We still need people to take care of the internal affairs of the family, and we still need people to, represent the family in social institutions and to work and provide. But now we need a different way of supporting that. And so the functionalist theory, they're not really saying like, yay, sexism or yay, patriarchy. They're just saying somebody needs to do this, right? And so we just got to figure out what are some other ways that we can get this work done. The easiest one obviously would be egalitarianism, but we live in a capitalist society, so yeah, and a very patriarchal society. So, what are your ideas? What are some other ways that we can divvy up this labor and get things done? So when we talk about conflict theory, I'm actually going to split this into two separate areas because there's conflict theory overall, and then there's feminist theory, which falls into conflict theory. So overall, conflict theory says that the relationship between females and males has traditionally been one of unequal power, that any division of labor into instrumental and expressive tasks is far from neutral in its impact on women. in particular when that labor is expected to be done by women, that less valuable labor. Now, by valuable, I don't mean that it's not important because it is, and it actually is very valuable labor, but valuable as in like how much our society rewards that labor. So conflict theory looks at things like how did men initially gain power? How did this division even, start? And that's where we start looking at patriarchy, um, and some explanations for how patriarchy developed. One looks at perhaps men gaining power in pre-industrial times because of their size or physical strength, and the fact that they were free from childbearing duties, and how that was something that allowed them to dominate women physically. And so then the question is that a good reason today for why men would maintain power? Um, so also, um, the conflict perspective looks at struggles for dominance when it comes to gender and sex, and there could be lots of different struggles that we're looking at. We have those between men and women, and that's really looking at that binary. You could say that there are struggles for dominance between cisgender and transgender and or non-binary people as well, between heterosexuality and non-heterosexuality, or heteronormativity and non-heteronormativity. So there's a lot that could be covered here by the conflict theory. The conflict theory also, because it has very Marxist backgrounds, can obviously go into the direction of capitalism and questioning that capitalism, and how just capitalism in general is supported by the free care labor that's happening in the household. That labor is important, not just within the household and within the family, but also that it supports the market as well. Because you can't do what you do in the market if things are unstable, or chaotic at home. And so a lot of um, our ability to have these entrepreneurial and capitalistic pursuits is based on this expectation that women are going to be doing the free labor at home. And so, yeah, it's problematic. So, another element of conflict theory is looking at feminist theory, which is a form of conflict theory that is based on gender related issues. I just want to point out that it does not only focus on women, although this is a very important, obviously, element since a little over more than half of our world population is women. So, as I was saying, while feminist theory does critique and give thought on women's positions in society, it does a lot more than that. So, again, we look at sex and gender and capitalism, and so how capitalism relies on this division and exploitation when it comes to sex and gender, and capitalizes on it because it's capitalism. Play on words. And so, conflict theorist Frederick Engels, who was again a co-author and friend and supporter for Karl Marx, noted that women's subjugation coincided with the rise in private property. So, looking at that connection between women getting less and less autonomy, um, and being controlled more and more, and being kind of like limited to the private sphere with the rise in private property. Typically, the thought here is that because we started to take ownership or capitalistic relationship with land, resources, and property, then the importance of that capital staying within the family line kind of relied on making sure that your family was indeed your family and no one else could lay claim to it. And so basically, women and children, as a result, become also private property, right? And so you limit mobility so that no one can say that baby is their baby, right? It's your baby. It even has your name. It is baby of John Smith, right? Or wife of John Smith. In fact, many women, like, they weren't known by their name. They were Mrs. Insert husband's name here, Mrs. John Smith. Um, Many also view women's subordination as part of the overall exploitation and an injustice that is inherent to capitalist societies. Another thing that we look at when it comes to feminist theory is intersectionality. We've talked about intersectionality a lot in this course, how there are other factors that compound with gender, right? That create kind of like our position in a system of stratification. So, for example, I've used myself as an example that I'm a Black woman, and that I can't separate those two things. I'm not just a woman, and I'm not only Black, right? My identity and my existence, my experience is defined by both of those elements. And that could go beyond race and ethnicity into socioeconomic status, into able-bodiedness, into like whether you are neurodivergent or not, into heteronormativity or being non-heteronormative, and so on. And so there can be this convergence of social forces that can contribute to the loss of status of women when a lot of these high status identities intersect. We get what's called a matrix of domination. That's that convergence of social forces that gives more and more loss of status of women, right? And so when we see all of those identities that are, being male, being white, being an English speaker, being educated, all of these things start to combine and take away more and more from the status of women. Um, so yeah, we also look at men's feminism, which is kind of a really interesting area for me. There's so many different feminisms, by the way, so many. If you were to take a gender and sexuality class with me in the future, we would go into all of the various types of feminisms. So men's feminism is one, and this basically looks at how our patriarchy and our gender is really unhealthy for men and unhelpful for men. And so, really, how men are limited to just this one expectation for masculinity. So, men's feminism would push for this idea that there can be multiple masculinities, which basically is kind of looking at the contrast between femininity and masculinity. There are many ways to be feminine, right? If we even just look at some superficial things, you can still be considered feminine um, and wear pants, or that we have so many variations of living out that gender role. Being a tomboy or wearing like more masculine clothing is not viewed as necessarily being anti-feminist. I'm sorry, anti-femininity, right? It can also be reflected as a area of femininity. But if you look at men's fashion or men's clothing, there are limitations there. There are more restrictions. What colors men can wear, right? What styles they can wear. Can you wear a dress? Can you wear a skirt? Typically, no, although there are exceptions for cultural reasons, right? But then we'd ask, like, why? Why are you wearing a dress or a skirt? And so men are limited in how they're allowed to express their femininity in society in ways that are much stricter than what women experience. I'm not saying that men have it a lot harder than women, but there are challenges as well for men when it comes to patriarchy and sexism. And also that men often are, left out of some occupations and positions in society because they're men and not women. So, for example, this idea that if you're a man and you're going into the medical field, then you're expected to be a doctor. But if you don't want to be a doctor, right? Maybe you want to be a nurse. Well, suddenly you're not a nurse, you're a male nurse, right? And so there are some issues there that are really complex and nuanced that feminism supports. So anyone can be a feminist. Everyone can and should be a feminist because feminism is good for everyone. And so finally, with symbolic interaction, this is where we're again looking at the critical role of symbolism, right? And representation when it comes to human interaction. And so with symbolic interaction, we're looking at gender stratification and the impacts in everyday behavior. We're also looking at how we do gender, all of the dramaturgy that's involved. So, for example, the role of gender in cross sex conversations. Men are more likely to interrupt women when they're speaking. and we've gotten this from actual data from studies that have been done. The correlation may be linked, however, to status more than gender, but since men are more likely to be in these higher status positions, i.e., the interrupter position, then who actually knows? We can't really remove those measures there. But from anecdotal experience, even in these higher level like occupations and positions, men will interrupt women, and even when those women are in lower positions than women in higher positions, they will still interrupt women. Men are also more likely to mansplain. If you haven't heard what that is, go look it up. But to explain things to women as if though they are toddlers. I again have an anecdote for this. And you know what? While men are more likely to do it, they're not the only ones who do it. So again, I've also had to accuse other people who are not men or don't identify as men as being mansplainers as well. But I've had someone mansplain to me sociology who does not have a degree in sociology. So I have a PhD in sociology, in case you forgot. So it does happen. I've had people explain my own field to me, knowing that I have a doctorate in my own field. And so, yeah, there are some really interesting things that happen here. We might look at, again, this idea of doing gender and, women being expected to be small, right? And to make themselves small with smaller voices and to be quiet and to just be seen and not heard, and how that plays out, in the individual's identity and even in their body image, right? So yeah. We also look at the social creation of meanings and their fluidity. So changing meanings. For example, the word gay once meant cheerful. By the 1960s, it then carried the primary meaning of homosexual, right? And to the extent where it became not just a way to describe a homosexual, but it became an insult. My generation growing up, the word gay was used to say something negative, like, oh, that's so gay, was used to say that's so bad, which is horrible, horrific. But now we've changed that. And now I rarely hear young people, using that term in such a way. Um, and definitely not people of my generation. Hopefully they know better. Uh, and so we talk about the social construction of sexuality, the ways that socially constructed definitions about cultural appropriateness of sex-linked behavior emerge. So this idea of virginity, for example, as being something of value, when it's not actually something that is necessarily real, that it's a social construct, this idea that someone is pure because they haven't had sex, right? I don't get that. I don't get how that is valuable or an asset. And I also don't really understand, why that value is higher for women than it is for men, right? And part of the reason why I don't understand that is because there's nothing to understand. It's not real, right? Because it is a social construction. Um, and so things like that. We look at how we construct these ideas about who can have sex and when it's okay and when it isn't. The social constructions of even things like sexual assault or rape, and like how people define rape, and when they like start doing things like victim blaming and supporting rape culture and saying like, what were you wearing? Why were you in that location? Right? Instead of questioning, why has somebody violated your body, right? And what's wrong with that person, right, that did the violating. So when it comes to that social construction of sexuality, again, we have this linkage to something called biological determinism, this belief that our biology of men and women actually determines their difference when it comes to gender roles and behaviors, but also when it comes to sexuality. And it's a far stretch, right? There's this idea that men are more sexual than women. And again, that's a social construction that has endured for a very long time. It's more so that it's more socially acceptable for men to be sexual than for women to be sexual. And again, that goes back to the identity of purity and virginity and things like that. Why does no one, for example, do any kind of purity balls or things like that And I'm gonna give you guys a little like area in your module that kind of asks you about these balls. If you don't know what a purity ball is, prepare yourself. But why is no one pushing back from boys' sexuality and abstinence the way that they do for girls, right? Even in some parts of the world, they have these virginity tests to check if a girl is a virgin. And around the world, that used to be a valuable asset. And so, like literally, they would check sheets or things like that and confirm that a girl was a virgin, or else she would lose her dowry or her bride, like the actual value, right? And why is often a woman's virginity a statement on the status and the values of the entire family, and particularly of their father, right? Why are we giving them away and handing them over? And why is it kind of this expectation that the father is going to play the role of protecting that girl's virginity, right? And her purity, right? And her sexuality. So a lot of things we look at here, a lot of questions that we ask, and interactionism can be really fun to talk about. Not pleasing, right, and not optimistic, but fun to discuss as far as interesting and engaging. So yeah, can you think of anything else? You know, what are some of the meanings or the symbolisms when it comes to gender and sexuality that you have questions about, that you want to know, like what is that social construction and where does it come from? So when it comes to stratification and gender, sex, and sexuality, there's a lot to discuss, and I'm only able to highlight just a bit of that in this module. I'm going to start with LGBTQIA plus discrimination because it's more than just inequality and injustice. Often, or too often, it ends up also being fatal. Violence against queer people is not uncommon, and it falls into the category of hate crimes. And unfortunately, there's intersectionality here as well, where trans women and trans women of color in particular are more likely to experience this violence. There's basically a shocking proportion of murders of trans women of color, and in particular, Black trans women in the United States. And it's pretty invisible, it goes undiscussed, unfortunately. Another issue is the criminalization of non heterosexual sexuality, um, which has existed for quite some time in the United States. And around the world, there's still many countries that criminalize LGBTQIA identities, and I'll include those elsewhere in the module. In the United States, that decriminalization started in the 1960s, but wasn't really validated until 2003, right, until the 21st century. 20% of all hate crimes altogether have been committed against people who are queer identifying or LGBTQIA plus community members. And remember, I was mentioning about those countries that criminalize queer identities or behavior. So there are 6 countries in the world that are members of the United Nations. They're able to hold membership in the UN that impose the death penalty for queer activities, behavior, identities. And 61 nations penalize same sex acts. We have such a long way to go globally when it comes to gender, but also when it comes to sexuality. The US has made progress and strides, and I'm so grateful for that. But there are places in the world where it's still a crime to be who you are, right? Highly problematic. So again, while we've made some progress, we still have a lot of gaps. So there's sexism, there are prejudiced beliefs that value one sex over another, and that sexism can grow very complicated. Remember, I was talking about with care work and how sometimes men are shut out. So this could be an example of sexism where men are, thought of as being creepy if they want to work in a daycare or be a nanny, right? Or the sexism of women not being um, considered for some roles, or women being completely discriminated against altogether. We have sexual harassment, which is basically mistreatment of people, and particularly we see this a lot with women people, or those who identify as women, as a result of their sex. And usually with sexual harassment, we are looking at um, this inappropriate behavior in the workplace. So making comments or touching or anything like that would be considered sexual harassment, and that could include sexual assault as well. There are so many violences against women worldwide, and there's just so much, from rape, right, and sexual assault, to domestic violence and abuse. Um, uh, the majority of the time, these are committed against women and girls. To other violence against women, like dowry murder, which doesn't typically happen here in the United States, but is seen in some nations. Um, Internationally, where in order to get a second dowry, a bride may be murdered after the first dowry is received. And it will be something convenient like bride burning, where the kitchen is up in flames, but that woman's been trapped in that kitchen. To honor killings, where a girl who is expected of sexual behavior or even just inappropriate interaction with a boy, or in some of the worst cases, a girl who has been assaulted or raped by a boy will be murdered by her own family members in order to reinstate or maintain the honor and status of that family. Or things like infanticide, or sex selective abortion, where basically because a child is a female child, they are aborted or they are left exposed, or killed. And so, yeah, there's just a lot. Women just cannot live in peace internationally. Um, and I'll give you some more information on that as well in this module outside of the video. Um, and so, other issues that we see are things that comparably probably don't seem as bad when we talk about all the violence against women and femicide, or the murder of women. But things like division of labor, the expectation that women are going to do certain work, will be doing certain work, and men will be doing other types of work. Um, and the pay gap that comes along with these divisions of labor as well. Women making less, however, also in the same roles as men, right? And so there's the pay gap between men and women because the work that's deemed as being expressive or women's work is less valued than men's work, and because women are usually overrepresented in those areas. But also, even within the same work, in the same role, men still make more money than men. With the division of labor, it's also in the household. Women are still expected to do more household management. And even in places where we see that there's seemingly more equality, like you can see that both women and men are closer when it comes to the housework, it's not because men are doing more or that there's a balance. It's that we're outsourcing that work to other women to do. And so basically we bring in housekeepers and cleaners and cooks, not cookers, to do that labor instead. We have the glass ceiling, or this like invisible barrier, that keeps women from achieving the highest ranks of their positions, highest ranked positions of their occupation, of their work, because they're not viewed as being managerial, or CEO material. And then we have on the flip side this idea of the glass escalator, where oftentimes when men are in positions that have traditionally been viewed as women's work, they're able to accelerate to the top much more quickly than women. So, yeah, there's a lot there. We also have this idea of misogyny overall, And misogyny is a hatred or an aversion to women. And misogyny can lead to a lot of the problems that we've mentioned above, or they can reinforce those problems. Inside misogyny actually has not diminished in our society. It's just now starting to pop up in different ways. We see it online. We see it, for example, with incels. You can go look that up, but involuntary celibate is a term that's used for these men who are identifying themselves as being involuntarily celibate because women make bad decisions and don't pick them. Red flags for this are I'm a good guy. I don't know why women don't want to date me. They're just picking all these dorks or jerks. If you're saying that, if you have to call yourself a good guy, that's usually not a good sign. So if you're doing that, don't do that and maybe question some of your behavior and things like that. So yeah, we still got some ways to go, and hopefully we will get there.